Now, the RSA, as I hope more of you are coming to understand, is focusing its work on the issue of human capability. And the question that we ask is, how is it we can enable people to be the kinds of people they need to be to thrive in the future? And one important element of that story is how is it we encourage people to be more pro-social, altruistic, other regarding, give it whatever name you will. Our argument is that society can't flourish unless aggregately all of us contribute more to the strength of our social networks, social interactions, social spaces. So given that that is at the core of our mission, it's an incredibly great pleasure for us and incredibly relevant to us to be discussing the topic we'll be discussing today. It's my great pleasure to be welcoming today's speaker, Professor Sarah Blaffer Hrdy. Professor Hrdy is an award-winning author and is a leading anthropologist and primatologist. She's currently Professor Emerita at the University of California, Davis. She's a former Guggenheim Fellow and was elected to the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Her books have been widely praised, including her most recent work, which she's here to discuss today, Mothers and Others, The Evolutionary Origins of Mutual Understanding. It's a fantastic book. I've been reading it over the last few days, and it's absolutely fascinating and quite kind of uplifting. In the book, Professor Hrdy addresses one of the leading problems in sociobiology today. Why do we have pro-social emotions? Where does our capacity to cooperate in groups come from, to empathise with others, and to wonder what others are thinking and feeling? At what point in the evolution of our ape ancestors did these traits begin to develop, and why? As I say, these are fascinating issues for us here at the RSA as we try to understand and promote greater pro-social behaviour. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Sarah Hrdy.
Thank you, Matthew, for that introduction, and I feel very at home being in an organization whose mission is to promote a more principled and prosperous world. Charles Darwin's was an inspired guess back in 1871 when he hypothesized that Africa was formerly inhabited by extinct apes resembling today's gorillas and chimpanzees, and he hypothesized that our species evolved from such ancestors. This is why today we find a 99% overlap in the DNA sequences of humans and gorillas and bonobos. However, my focus today is on the differences, particularly on understanding how humans came to pay so much more attention to what other individuals are thinking and feeling than other apes do. Michael Tomasello's team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, one of the premier places for this kind of research, used a specially designed battery of socio-cognitive tests to compare 106 chimpanzees of all ages, 32 orangutans, and 105 human children 2.5 years old. What he and his team found was that in terms of cognitive abilities, such as remembering where an object was, spatial abilities, understanding quantities, are they many versus few, in terms of causality, what happens when I poke something with a stick, the apes and the human toddlers tested really in pretty much the same range. Where they really differed was in the social domain, in terms of social learning, watching a demonstrator solve a problem and then solving a problem the same way, in terms of communication, following where I'm pointing, for example, and also in terms of what psychologists call theory of mind, understanding somebody else's intentions. Humans also are far more eager to share than other apes are, and they do so readily, eagerly, and voluntarily right from an early age. And of course, such traits provide the building blocks for cooperation. you do see food sharing, you do see a willingness to help in chimpanzees and bonobos, but it's at a much lower level, and it's often much more like scrounging or tolerated theft than voluntary sharing, and usually the receiver has to beg first. These traits I'm talking about are the underpinnings for the kind of cooperation that humans excel at. Why then should humans differ so much from other apes in this respect? Well, we used to think we knew. When I was in graduate school and deep into my career, we were told that it was the ability to imitate others, and it was assumed that, quote, this neurocognitive machinery of imitation lies at the origins of peculiarly human capacities for empathy and developing a theory of mind. This was a famous study by Andy Meltzoff that was published in Science back in 1977, showing that right from birth, a human infant, you catch him at the right moment, will imitate what someone else is doing. Stick out your tongue, baby will stick out your tongue. Try this in an airport if you've got time on your hands. It works. So this is what we thought. But the recent discovery that newborn chimpanzees as well can imitate others and make funny faces, along with the realization that even small-brained monkeys, like macaques, have mirror neurons, suggesting that the basic wiring for identifying with others is present in other primates as well. The big difference has to do with what happens next. While over the course of their development, human babies become more and more interested in monitoring, imitating, and engaging others, and in seeking to understand what they are thinking and feeling, little chimpanzees, after an initial burst of enthusiasm, lose interest by about 12 weeks. So why are humans so much more other-regarding? In 1871 as well, Darwin proposed that a tribe including many members who were always ready to give aid to each other and sacrifice themselves for the common good would be victorious over other tribes. Today, this idea that we needed group solidarity in order to defend against outsiders has become the explanation of choice, often the only explanation considered, for humankind's peculiarly pro-social natures, invoked without considering alternative hypotheses. Recent essays in Science, in the New Scientist actually, you may have read it, last year pronounced that there was now a consensus among scientists that these traits were due to warfare. Proposed, as in this recent essay in the British journal Nature, generosity and solidarity towards one's own may have emerged only in combination with hostility towards outsider. Conflict was seen as altruism's midwife. Proponents of this interdemic conflict hypothesis compare the mutual loathing between tribes to, quote, the genocidal urges of chimpanzees, which in fact are there in chimpanzees, and take for granted that our ancestors spent the last 5 million years in chronic intergroup warfare. No one doubts that outside enemies can enhance in-group solidarity. Social psychologists have been arguing this and presenting evidence for this for a long time. But if we are interested in the initial emergence of altruistic and hypersocial tendencies in our species, in this one particular line of apes, by itself, intergroup conflict is not a very satisfying explanation. This leads me to ask whether our pre-human ancestors confronted a more pressing challenge than avoiding being wiped out by their neighbors. Perhaps they were having trouble rearing offspring that survived. By 1.8 million years ago, bipedal hominids in the African branch of Homo erectus, sometimes referred to as Homo ergaster, were beginning to evolve larger brains and body size and to mature more slowly than other apes do. And the price tags for rearing youngsters was beginning to creep up towards the 13 or so million calories that it takes foragers today to successfully rear a child, far more than a mother by herself could provide, especially since new babies were likely to be born before previous children were nutritionally self-sufficient. None of us has a machine to go back in time and observe how children were reared in the Pleistocene. But based on information from still extant hunting and gathering peoples, the average 3 to 4 year interval between births is much shorter than the 4 to 8 year intervals typical of other apes. And this is so even though humans are born bigger and they take longer to mature. So how can this be? The answer, I suspect you've already guessed, it has to do with allomaternal provisioning. In other apes, infants once weaned completely provision themselves, but human children remain dependent on others for many years. Even with help from her mate, the vagaries of hunting, you don't always succeed when you go out hunting, meant that by himself, a Pleistocene father could not always meet the needs of children who have to eat several times a day. Without alloparental, group members other than the parents, as well as parental care and provisioning, our ancestors could not have produced young that survived, so that early hominins must have evolved as cooperative breeders. This is the term used for a species where you have alloparental care and provisioning of someone else's young. Within the field of sociobiology, there now exists a robust body of theory to explain why alloparents would ever find it advantageous to care for and provision someone else's young. Alloparental provisioning buffers slow maturing offspring from starvation and permits long periods of post-weaning, or in the case of birds, post-fledging dependence, which of course in humans is what we call childhood. Even though no ape other than humans exhibits shared care of newborns, such shared care has evolved many times among other primates, prosimians and monkeys, and in more than half of the species in the highly social order primates, you find infant sharing, mothers readily tolerating other group members who take and carry their new infant so that the mother can feed, and freed to forage, she breeds again sooner. Allo mothers are attracted to babies and very eager to take them, and in more than 20%, roughly 24% of primates, you have shared care accompanied by at least minimal alloparental provisioning, even though often this is nothing more than one mother occasionally suckling the infant of another. As genteel as all this sharing seems, cooperative breeding does not mean that everybody necessarily cooperates all the time. Among these tamarins, there can be a lot of competition, especially over access to the babysitters. To maintain her monopoly on caretakers, a pregnant marmoset may, for example, kill her rival's young, even if her rival is her own daughter. So this is the grandmother from hell. Faced with insufficient allomaternal assistance, tamarins and humans also exhibit a distinctly unprimate-like tendency to discard their own newborns. Tamarins and humans are the only primates in which mothers have ever been observed to harm their own infants under natural conditions. This is the dark side of cooperative breeding. In addition to contingent maternal commitment, the mother might retrench, might not invest, the other big similarity between humans and these very distantly related, tiny-brained South American monkeys is the high level of maternal tolerance towards others. In other apes, mothers are extraordinarily possessive of their baby. this newborn chimpanzee will be in continuous skin-to-skin contact with his mother for 100% of the day, 100% of the night, for the first 6 months. This orangutan mother will nurse her infant for the first 7 years. Poachers know this. If they want to capture a baby to sell in the market, the only way they're going to get their hands on it is first shoot the mother. So this is the tragic side of that business. Clearly, the luck of the demographic draw, just which kin are still alive, don't have malaria that week, good at finding food, not encumbered by young of their own, the luck of the demographic draw is going to be very important. Luckiest of all are the children with 2 dedicated parents and an assortment of alloparents, uncles, aunts, older siblings, and if fortunate enough to have a still productive and surviving one, grandmothers. Fortunately for our species and the fact that we're here today, flexibility and mobility were hallmarks of forager families. People moved away from adversity, gravitated towards opportunities, and those opportunities included social opportunities, access to allomaternal help, or the possibility of giving allomaternal help to a kinswoman who needed it. For those of you wondering why, if alloparental care was so essential, and there's just a growing body of evidence, just as we've started to look at this in the last 10 years, that having alloparental assistance enhances infant and child survival. So it's as if it was as important as I'm saying here, how come no one noticed it before? I suspect the answer has to do with the fact that until very recently, the detailed studies of child development were done in low mortality, post-industrial societies like our own. In Western societies today, in the developed world, fewer than 2% of babies born die in childhood. However, child mortality rates are much higher in the developing world, where there's limited access to clean water and medical care, and where child mortality rates of 40 to 60% are not uncommon. Similar mortality rates are typical for traditional societies, for many wild non-human primate populations, and almost certainly pertained among our Pleistocene ancestors as well. The mother was the most important for child survival. The father is kind of interesting. He varied. In some cultures, under some ecological conditions, depending on who else was there to help, his presence was absolutely critical. In other cultures, under different ecological conditions, there was no impact of paternal care at all, provided others were there to fill in what was needed. The most consistently reliable impact was from older siblings and from grandparents. This is not saying fathers aren't important. It's saying their contributions are highly variable. In itself a question, why human paternal care is so facultative. By now, the demographic implications of alloparental care and provisioning are so well documented, even though it's only been in the last 10 years, I think we can take it as granted that our ancestors must have evolved as cooperative breeders. And so it's time to consider the cognitive and the emotional implications of this legacy. The implications for an ape growing up dependent on multiple others. I have been particularly interested in what information from sociobiology, neuroscience, psychology, and from a very exciting emerging field that I call comparative infant development, what it can tell us about how such an unape-like mode of child rearing affects traits like mutual tolerance, perspective taking, and social learning, the kinds of traits Matthew talked about in his introduction. I have time for only a few highlights of this quest. Even without taking child survival or evolutionary perspectives into account, social workers, historians of the family, and some psychologists have known for a long time that living in extended families affects both maternal commitment and child development. In conclusion, I am not suggesting that competition between groups was or is unimportant for enhancing group solidarity or shaping traits like ethnocentrism or indoctrinability. We're a very indoctrinable species, unfortunately, very subject to propaganda on this score. But I think this is more recent. Furthermore, what concerns me is that by focusing so exclusively on overt intergroup conflict, we overlook occupations such as child rearing that are at least as important, and in my opinion more important, for explaining selection pressures favoring the initial emergence of peculiarly prosocial giving impulses in the line of apes leading to the genus Homo. If, as I propose, apes interested in the mental and emotional states of others evolved as a byproduct of cooperative breeding, this means that long before the evolution of behaviorally modern humans capable of language and symbolic thought within the last maybe 100,000 years, and even before the evolution of big-brained, full-sized brain, anatomically modern humans within the last 200,000 years, emotionally modern humans were already questing for intersubjective engagement with each other. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you for that. We have 150 speakers a year here, and I just think that was one of the most kind of memorable speeches we've had for a long time. So thank you so much for that. Now, I'm not a scientist, so I'm going to ask kind of really stupid questions, but you're a very tolerant person, so I'm sure you'll put up with that. And then we'll open up to the audience and we'll finish at about 2 o'clock, so people have got plenty of time to buy the book. And can I underline that, having read quite a lot of the book, that there's so much richness in the book which you haven't been able to cover here, so I recommend to people to get it. The first question I want to ask is how do you distinguish it in terms of the effect on child development between effects which are indirect as a consequence of mothers having support and effects which are direct in terms of the development of the child's own brain and behaviour? So you could argue that the actual dependent variable is how happy your mum is, and your mum's more likely to be happy if your mum's got other friends and others around. So there's no kind of direct effect here. So can you untangle that for us?
In my own life, certainly my life as a mother, the British psychiatrist John Bowlby was tremendously important. I feel that this is an evolutionary psychologist in the best sense who has made tremendous contributions to human well-being. In this book, I'm very careful to say that even though I'm correcting something in Bowlby, he picked the wrong primate models. He thought that our ancestors must have been like chimpanzees, where the mother holds the infant the whole time. And generations of attachment theorists and developmental psychologists have worked with this model. On the whole, the model has been a force for the good. It's made for much more humane childcare, but it did leave out the role of alloparents, and we're just now starting to collect the information that would allow us to answer your question.
And I know this isn't the kind of thing you do, but do you have a hunch? Do you have a hunch as to whether the effect of alloparents is direct on the child's development or indirect through the support of the mother?
Well, I think it was direct in the most critical sense, support. And the reason I say that is when a marmoset or a tamarin mother abandons her baby at birth, which, as I say, is very unusual to have happen in primates, except maybe a first-time inexperienced mother who can be kind of incompetent and doesn't know what she's doing, but an experienced female never abandons her baby. It's never been observed among wild primates. But marmosets and tamarins do. And when they do, they have very high rates of infant abandonment. It's when the mother does not have help. And in an earlier book, Mother Nature, I actually reviewed a great deal of evidence on infanticide and child abuse and child abandonment in the history of our own species. And, you know, the take-home message is that wherever mothers do not have access to birth control and where they do not have social support, those mothers bail out at birth. And the human history is littered with neonatal abandonment. And, you know, we're just coming to terms with this in the social sciences, but it's very much part of our history. So a mother without social support, that baby is not even going to get to first base. Once the baby is taken up by the mother, because of course we're hairless, too bad, you know, there's nothing to cling to, and the mother has to gather the baby, and the baby is actually quite vigorous and has its own abilities. It's immobile on the ground, but it can certainly manipulate on her body. Once the baby is at her breast, and milk usually comes in about 2 days after birth. Once the mother is lactating, the baby has her on what I call a mammary leash, because her physiology starts to be transformed, and her prolactin is going up, and oxytocin is going. As she nurses, she finds this a very satisfying sensation. My guess is a lot of the data we have out there for mothers who abuse their infants when we're not talking about abandonment at birth, but later on, very few of these mothers are going to have been breastfeeding. So the maternal support is important for the mother to make that initial commitment.
Okay. I'm going to ask 2 more short questions and then we bring the audience in. So that's the way of me saying you have to give us short answers or else we won't be able to bring the audience in. Why do you think it is that people adhered for so long and still want to adhere to a view which is that human beings are basically nasty, and if they're nice, it's only nice in order to be more effectively nasty? I mean, that's a kind of peculiar thing, isn't it, that when people observe niceness, they have to find an explanation that it's a better way of being nasty.
You're amazing how certain people are. You know, we do have data for the last 15,000 years of warfare, but none of it goes back earlier. A man named Doug Fry in Finland has written a very interesting book published by Oxford. I forget what it's called. It's got 2 sort of peacenik. It's sandwiched. Beginning and end is kind of peacenik, but the middle is a wonderful review of ethnography, and it's ethnography consistent also with my reading of the anthropological literature, which is in small band, mobile hunter-gatherers living at low population densities. Groups almost never engage in socially organized warfare. This is not to say there's not conspecific killing, sexual jealousy, male-male combat, infanticide. These things happen. Socially organized, you don't find that kind of warfare until you get complex hunter-gatherer societies, larger, often sort of settling down near a rich resource, like in Northwest America on the Northwest coast. Certainly with the Neolithic Revolution, with agriculture, with herding, you have resources where it's valuable where it serves your interests to compete for them and to protect them. Then you start to get this kind of fighting. But in the early Pleistocene, you couldn't afford that kind of loss of manpower. There'd just be 2 or 3 men in a group. My sense is, like most primates, they avoided this kind of full-fledged intergroup fight. It's very rare in animals. You see it in chimpanzees, you see it in meerkats, you might have it in lions, you might have it in hyenas. It's not a common thing. Where you find it is in the social insects, army ants and so forth. But it's very important to remember, in the social insects, they evolved cooperative breeding leading to eusociality and the sterile cats before. Those are the primitive eusocials before you get to these warfare guys. I'm saying that this stuff came first. It's a matter of sequence.
You're very charitable. I thought you might say that given the importance of mothers to the emergence of cooperation, the fact that science has been dominated by men might have been in some way implicated in the attempt to demonstrate that nastiness is at the heart of human evolution.
Well, I think it is shocking. I think it is shocking that this very obvious difference between humans and other apes, the fact that human mothers share care of their offspring, that no one actually made anything of it until I published this book. And yes, I do think that although I think women do science pretty much in the same way men do, we tend to ask different questions. We get intrigued by different problems. And so it probably was relevant that I was a mother.